The trees were still bare. It was the 15th of April, 1945, in the forests of northern Germany, and the British soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division were pushing east toward enemy lines. They were tired. They had been fighting for months. They expected barbed wire, guard towers, maybe a final desperate SS stand. They were not prepared for the smell. One soldier would remember it later, how it came through the trees like a wall, not just bad, not rotten food or fouled latrines. This was something else, something that made grown men gag. It was the smell of 13,000 corpses rotting in the open air. And when they got closer, they saw why. The 11th Armored Division had just liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and what they found would become the single most horrifying revelation of the entire war. Not a death factory with gas chambers like Auschwitz, not an industrial killing center. Belsen was something different. It was deliberate starvation. It was disease left to run wild. It was the Nazi regime's casual, methodical choice to let people die in heaps because they were not worth the effort to kill formally. Inside the camp gates, British soldiers walked into a landscape from a nightmare. Over 60,000 prisoners were still alive, if you could call it alive. They were skeletons. Some weighed less than 80 pounds. Their eyes were black sockets. Their skin hung off bone. They could barely stand. They could barely speak. Many would not survive the day, let alone the week. The British had come to liberate them, but they could not liberate the dead, and there were so many dead. 13,000 corpses lay scattered across the camp. Some were in barracks. Some were piled in heaps. Some were half buried in mass graves that had been abandoned, half finished, as if the SS had simply given up the pretense of disposal. They lay where they had fallen. They lay in the mud. They lay among the living, so that the survivors had to step over their friends to find food that was mostly gone anyway. The British had seen death. They had seen combat. They had seen bombing runs that turned cities to rubble. But nothing had prepared them for this. One British officer who entered the camp that afternoon was Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin. He kept a diary. Here is what he wrote, in words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I can give no adequate description of the horror camp in which these thousands of individuals were gathered. I have never seen British soldiers cry before, but I saw them cry then. To understand what happened at Belsen, you have to understand what made it different. From the extermination camps of Eastern Europe, Auschwitz had gas chambers. Treblinka had crematoria running 24 hours a day. These were machines built for one purpose: to kill as many people as fast as possible. Belsen had no gas chambers. What it had was starvation. What it had was typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis spreading through barracks, where 30,000 people were packed into space built for 5,000. What it had was a commandant named Joseph Kramer, who had been transferred from Auschwitz-Birkenau in December 1944. A man so thoroughly immersed in the machinery of genocide that his presence alone seemed to rot the place from within. Kramer did not need gas chambers. The hunger did the work. The disease did the work. The simple, brutal logic of overcrowding and neglect did the work. And as the war collapsed around Nazi Germany in early 1945, Kramer did nothing to stop it. In fact, conditions got worse. In January 1945, the Nazis began evacuating camps in the east as Soviet forces advanced. Thousands of prisoners from camps like Auschwitz were forced on death. Marches westward. Belsen became a dumping ground. Prisoners arrived with frostbite. Prisoners arrived already dying. Prisoners arrived to find no food. no medical care, no sanitation. By March, the camp held 45,000 people. By April, people were dying faster than the ground could absorb them. But here is something that complicates the story. In the days before liberation, the Nazi commandant at Belsen and others in the German High Command realized the war was finished. No more reinforcements were coming. No more fuel. No more anything. The Americans and British were closing in from the west. The Soviets were coming from the east. For the first time, some German officers understood that survival meant surrender. On the 11th of April, 1945, the Germans sent a message. They wanted to, end quote, declare Belsen a neutral zone. They wanted to negotiate a peaceful handover. They did not want the camp destroyed. They did not want fighting inside the camp where the sick were lying. For 4 days, both sides negotiated. The British agreed. There would be no bombardment. The German garrison would to surrender the camp intact. And on the 15th of April, 135 days before the final German surrender, the 11th Armored Division rolled through the problems. Gates. They were not ready for what waited. Brigadier Glyn Hughes was the Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army. When he entered Belsen that morning, he knew his military training was worthless. There was no protocol for this, no field manual for the mountains of corpses, no regulations for the living skeletons who could barely lift their heads. He made a decision. Belsen would become a hospital. The British began commandeering German army barracks a few miles away. They began moving the sick, those who could be moved into some semblance of care. They set up field hospitals. They brought in doctors. They made medicines from what little they could find. But the death did not stop. In the first days after liberation, over 500 people died every single day. 500 per day. The diseases would not stop just because the British had arrived. Typhus did not care about freedom. Dysentery did not know the war was over. Tuberculosis kept spreading through barracks where men and women lay pressed against each other, their lungs failing in the dark. By the 16th of April, 1 day after liberation, 300 more were dead. By the 17th, another 400. The gravediggers, mostly German prisoners, and Nazi guards forced to do the work as part of their penance, could barely keep up. The British brought in bulldozers. The local German mayors from nearby towns were forced to watch the mass graves being dug. They were made to stand at the edge and witness what had been done in their region, in their backyard, while they claimed they did not know. Some local women were forced to watch too, to see the bodies, to understand. It took more than a month for the death rate to fall below 100 a day. In total, 13,000 people who survived the gates of Belsen on the 15th of April would be dead within weeks. 13,000 people liberated only to be killed by the diseases that the camp had planted in them like seeds. We save them and they die anyway, one British medic wrote. What was the point? There would be no good answer. But something happened that changed everything. A BBC radio correspondent named Richard Dimbleby entered the camp on the 17th of April, 1945. He was a war correspondent. He had covered the North African campaign. He had reported on D-Day. He had seen death before. He walked into Bergen-Belsen, and he could not speak for hours. When he finally broadcast his report transmitted back to Britain on BBC Radio, his voice was different. It was not the voice of a professional newsman delivering facts from a distance. It was the voice of a man who had seen something that broke him. Here over this small hill is a mass grave, he said. The Germans were trying to clear the Brand camp of some of the prisoners. Out of the poor wretches they had to find, they attempted to bury them with bulldozers, but they have not done a very good job. The corpses are still lying about. I have seen many terrible sights in my life, but I did not think I had ever seen anything quite so horrifying. His broadcast was released in Britain the next day. and Britain heard it. For the first time, millions of British people understood what had actually happened in Nazi Germany. It was not rumor, it was not propaganda, it was a correspondent they trusted, a man of integrity, saying in his own voice, "I have seen this. It is real. It is worse. It is than you can imagine." Some people still did not believe. Some British soldiers, some people back home, thought it was exaggerated, thought it was designed to justify the war, thought someone was lying for effect. It was easier not to believe. It was easier to go home and forget. But most understood. Most had to understand. Richard Dimbleby's voice, steady, broken, factual, had forced them to know. Among the 60,000 prisoners at Belsen, there was a girl named Anne Frank. Anne Frank did not die in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, although she had been imprisoned there. She did not die during a death march, although she had walked one. She died at Bergen-Belsen in February or March of 1945 in the chaos of the final months of the camp, with no one to mark her death, no grave to mark her body. She was 15 years old. She died of typhus. She died 2 months before the British liberated the camp, 2 months before Brigadier Hughes could have saved her, 2 months before Richard Dimbleby could have testified to her existence. She was a girl who had hidden in an attic in Amsterdam, a girl who had kept a diary, a girl who had written while in hiding about the world she wanted to see after the war. She had wanted to be a writer. She had wanted to matter. And by the time the British arrived, she was already buried in a mass grave somewhere, unmourned, unnamed, just one more typhus victim in a camp of 30,000 dying people. Her father, Otto Frank, survived. He would survive to read her diary, the one she had, kept while hiding, and share it with the world. Her story would matter. But Anne herself, a Don Hover, never got to see the liberation, never got to leave the camp alive. She was 2 months too soon. Josef Kramer, the commandant of Bergen-Belsen, tried to run when the British arrived. The British caught him. He was put on trial in Lüneburg in September 1945. The trial lasted 2 months. The testimony was devastating. Survivors spoke. British officers spoke. The full scope of the death and neglect at Belsen was laid out, documented, recorded. Kramer claimed he had done his duty. He claimed he had only followed orders. He claimed he was not responsible. He was found guilty of war crimes. He was executed by hanging on the 13th of December, 1945. Just 8 months after he had stood inside the gates of the camp, he had run into chaos. His death did not bring back the 13,000. His death did not resurrect Anne Frank. Buti was something. It was the world saying, there are consequences. You do not get to do this and walk away. You do not get to starve people and let them rot and then claim you. We're just following orders. You will hang for it. On the 21st of May, 1945, 6 weeks after liberation, the British burned Belsen to the ground. Not the prisoners, not the sick. Everyone had been evacuated by then, moved to the prisoners. German army barracks that had been converted into a hospital, but barracks. Themselves, the buildings where the prisoners had died, the ground where the corpses had lain, all of it was burned. The British erected a simple wooden sign where the camp had stood. This is the site of the infamous Bergen-Belsen concentration camp liberated by the British on the 15th of April, 1945. 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died. All of them were victims of the past. German New Order in Europe and an example of Nazi culture. May they rest in peace. The sign has long since rotted away. The barracks have been replaced by a monument. Visitors come now to remember. They come to see where 13,000 people were, left to rot in the mud. They come to understand what the Nazis were capable of. They come to understand what happens when ordinary people consent to cruelty, when officers follow orders, when governments decide some lives are disposable. They come because Richard Dimbleby made them understand, because Mervyn Gonen wrote it down, because the British 11th Armoured Division refused to look away. The question that haunts any conversation about Bergen-Belsen is not what happened, it is why. Why did it take the British soldiers to stop it? Why did the world not know before April 15th? Why did the international community not demand action? Why were there no air raids on the camp, no special rescue missions, no effort to liberate prisoners before the final collapse of the Third Reich? The answer, uncomfortable as it is partly about ignorance. The Allies genuinely did not know the full scope of what was happening in the camps until very late in the war. Intelligence was incomplete. Butitis also about choice. The world, in 1945, was busy with its own survival. The Allies were fighting to win the war. Prisoners were not their priority. The machinery of rescue was not Putin. Motion. The pressure was not applied, and 13,000 people died of typhus and dysentery and starvation in a camp that could have been liberated months earlier, that could have been bombed, that could have been interrupted. Bearing witness to this is not pleasant. Understanding itis not comfortable, but forgetting itis worse. So here's the question for you. Did the world do enough to stop the Holocaust? Do you think the Allies should have prioritized rescue operations over military strategy? Should more countries have opened their borders to refugees in the years before 1945? Comment below. Let me know what you think. And if this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, hit that like button. It helps us reach people who need to understand this history. There's a whole playlist of videos about the liberation of the camps. Click right here. Each one tells a story that the world nearly forgot. Thanks for watching. Thanks for bearing witness. Thanks for remembering. See you in the next one.